Stories tomorrow are very different from what you read today, and this is one of the things I said about Agnon, is that he writes in different styles, and different genres, and what we read today is something that resembles a realistic novel, right, in that style. For tomorrow, there are going to be two stories that are written more as, more like Kafka, more like parables, which are not realistic. In fact, in these stories, the laws of nature, the laws of reality don't really apply. And the going from event to event resembles more what happens when you have a dream, where in a dream you can be one place and the next minute you can be 1,000 miles away, and it doesn't have the logic of the physical laws of nature, but rather it has a kind of psychological or even philosophical logic. So you have to prepare yourself for something that's very different from expecting things to make sense, to be realistic. Another difference is that in these stories, there is an autobiographical narrator. There's an I who seems to be somebody like Agnon. In general, it's very important to make the distinction, and I'm sure you've learned this if you've taken any literature classes, between the author versus the narrator. Okay, the author is the historical person, Agnon, the person who lived from 1887 to 1970, who wrote stories in many different ways. In each of the stories, there is a different kind of narrator. So in a simple story, what we read for today, there's a narrator who's a kind of a novelist who seems to believe in God, and he talks about what God's plan is for things, but is basically describing social reality and doesn't tell you very much about himself. He doesn't use the first person. In the stories for tomorrow, the narrator is going to look something like the author. It's going to be a man. He lives in Palestine. He seems to be somewhat religious. He wants to do the right thing. And he is somebody kind of like Agnon. And so what Agnon is doing is he's using an autobiographical persona. Remember, persona is the word that we used for a kind of a mask. So he's deliberately, for the purpose of those stories, decides to make himself into a kind of character who's telling the story. And what's wonderful about Agnon is that he makes his autobiographical narrators the objects of comedy. They're very ironic. They're not perfect. They're very flawed. They have a lot of problems. So he doesn't idealize himself, but rather presents an I as a who is something like what we call in English literature an everyman. There's an average person, somebody who is not special, who has problems, is vulnerable, wants to do the right thing, but has all sorts of inner obstacles. So in both of the stories, there's going to be the autobiographical narrator. Now, what I'd like you to do is in the first story, which is called A Whole Loaf. What is it in Russian? Does it have that title also?
Полная любовь.
So what does that mean?
It's a love which is spread in your soul, in your mind, in your word.
Yeah.
Something like this.
The bread?
Spread.
Spread. So that's the title of the story. There are two stories for tomorrow. One is, I want to make sure we're all reading the right stories. So one in English and Hebrew is called like a loaf of bread, a whole loaf.
Oh.
A loaf, like a...
Not whole.
A whole loaf.
Mm-hmm.
Now, is that, what's the Russian title? Is that the Russian title?
Mm-hmm.
This,
Ні. Це як кусок хліба, буханка хліба, мабуть, що так. Я, чесно говоря, не знаю, як там назвати російською. Може, буханка хліба.
That's the title of the story. I just want to make sure that, does anybody have the list there? And
what is it? I don't know.
In English, it's a whole, complete loaf of bread.
Буханка хліба, not whole, but half.
Okay. And the second story is about going from house to house, or from an apartment to an apartment. Okay, that's the second story? Okay, I just want to, as we say in English, we're on the same page. I don't want to come in tomorrow and begin speaking about stories that... Okay. So, in the first story, the one that's about the loaf of bread, it's about a man who is facing a choice, a dilemma, about whether to deliver some letters in the mail, to post letters, but he's very hungry. So the question is whether to have his meal and then post the letters, or post the letters and then have his meal. And he receives the letters from a very scholarly figure who the Hebrew reader would recognize as Moses from the Bible. Moses as the lawgiver who gave the 5 books of Moses, the first part of the Hebrew Bible. So that's why this is not realistic. So there's a figure who is like Moses who gives him the task of delivering the letters, and the letters represent the commandments. In Jewish religion, the mitzvot are the daily tasks that you have of prayer and study, charity, all of the rituals. These are the commandments. So the letters represent the commandments. But yet he's gone through a whole day of the Sabbath without eating, and he's in an internal struggle about whether to fulfill the task of mailing the letters, but he wants to eat. So it's a symbolic, so to understand the symbolic struggle, what the letters represent and what the desire to eat represents, and why he can't decide what are the obstacles that prevent him from doing one or the other. In the end, he doesn't fulfill either of those. Okay, the second story is one that is about also a protagonist, a hero like Agnon, who is sick and is searching for a house, an apartment to be in, where he can be at peace, he can be tranquil. And in the end, he decides to give up the opportunity in favor of taking care of a child. And so the question is, what does this search for a flat, an apartment represent? What is the symbolism of the house, finding a house to be in? And why does the narrator give up his happiness? Okay, so those are some of the things to think about. The stories tomorrow, which are much shorter than the novel today. So, is the Russian title also a simple story? in Russian as well. Okay. Good. This was written in 1935, when after Agnon had, of course, returned to Palestine. The question is, what is the historical period in which the action of the novel is set? Do we have any hints about when this takes place?
This mentions that it was a time when Russian-Japanese war. So, and also it mentions that it's a time of in Austrian-Hungarian Empire of Imperial France Joseph II.
Yeah, but that was he ruled for a long time, so you couldn't pin it down to that.
He said that the case of Dreyfus
is kind of finished, right? Okay. But the Russo-Japanese War is a very good indicator. And what years is that about?
It's first decade of the 20th century.
Right. So it's 1903 to 1907, something like that. So the novel takes place over 4 years. And it coincides with Herschel goes from age 16 to age 20. Everybody's young. You think that the parents are really old, but they're only 48 years old. It's interesting. So that helps us. So we're before World War I. In this world of Galician Jewry, World War I is the great boundary, because the war destroyed much of Galician Jewry. And then the Civil War afterwards, and then the Ukrainian nationalists after that, into 1921, essentially destroyed. Not the same as the Nazis, but it had really reduced Jewish life enormously. So this is before the fall. While during the Great Continuity, we have Galician Jewry prospering. What's the economic picture we have of Buczacz here? Why is Buczacz doing well economically? What do the Jews do by and large in Buczacz?
Merchants.
They're merchants and shopkeepers, right? And why are they doing well? In other words, who are they servicing? Where does their business come from?
Even from Germany, they are selling eggs to Germany.
Yes, there is some cross-national trade, but most of it is from servicing the 100 or so villages that are in the area. And this is very characteristic of Galicia, Ukraine at this time, that there weren't that many cities, but there were hundreds and hundreds of villages. The villages and the cities were often formally owned by Polish nobles. So in Buczacz, it's surrounded by hundreds of villages, and the villagers are raising agricultural produce and animals and so forth. But what do they need? Why do they have to come into town, into Buczacz?
Shopping?
Well, they're there to shop. They're there to do two things. They're there also to market their produce, to sell, because that's a central place. But they're also there to buy things that they can't manufacture themselves. Or if once upon a time, earlier in the 19th century, people would spin their own clothes and fabric and so forth. Now, with the era of mass production, they go into Buczacz and you buy a dress, and things, or brushes. And so this was the trade. The Jews were a kind of a service economy for this large agricultural region around that. And as we're told in the story, these were good times. And both the Jewish and non-Jewish population of Buczacz had grown. Are we told how many Jews live in Buczacz? Remember?
Oh, more than 50%.
Yeah, I think it's about 8,000. So you put that together, it's not, you know, if there are 16,000 people, it's not very big, but it was big relative to the size of these rural settlements around. So, again, we're at the end of the great era of Galician Jewry, before the destruction of World War I, Civil War, the Poltura bands, but also at the end of a kind of religious civilization, because this is already the beginning of the 20th century. And what are some of the changes that you see present in the world of Buczacz that would not have been there 100 years before?
The reconstruction of synagogue.
Yes, the repainting,
which was
the synagogue, right?
Never renovated more than 150 years.
Right.
And it was completely changed its interior.
But
and
is that
people from this village, they were not satisfied with this.
Well, there was one man who thought that the stars and the iconography that had been there should not be painted over. But is the renovation of the synagogue a sign that religious life is strong in Buczacz?
No.
No. This is, the great change is the values of the community. Once, there were always merchants, but the rabbis and the scholars had the great sense of importance and prestige. And that's what you wanted your son to become, if you could afford it, to have him become a scholar or a rabbi. Now, that scholarly religious civilization is being pushed to the background by what? What are the new values in the community?
And socialist ideas and Zionism ideas.
There are new ideologies.
Ideologies.
Right. Zionism and socialism of various sorts. And socialism has two faces. One is Jewish and non-Jewish. And we have the figure, the assistant in the shop, Getzel, who's part of the Jewish socialists, and we hear about the Zionist movement, which is gaining strength as well. But there's also something more subtle, which is the young people now want to go to university. They want to become lawyers and doctors and professionals, as well as merchants. And even though they may have studied in the Cheder, remember that was the Jewish elementary school, or the Beit Midrash, or the yeshiva, here we have Herschel. Herschel has been a student of the Talmud, but he leaves it, and then he doesn't come back. He performs his religious duties, but he's no longer in the world of religious studies. And that's true for everybody else that we see in the novel. They maintain certain rituals and certain piety, but they are living their life in this world. And the world of religious studies and religious devotion does not have a strong hold on them. They pay their dues. They're proper, but there's a process of secularization that has taken place that has not been a revolutionary rejection, but it's been a gradual withdrawal, a gradual rolling back of the dominance of religious vocations, of learning and studying sacred texts as a primary occupation for Jewish men. We don't really meet any rabbis in this novel, right? And so that's a second point I want to make is that whenever whenever a novelist writes a novel, he or she makes a selection of the reality that they want to present. And this is the term representation. Representation is not to copy, but to select, make certain things more important than others, to place things, some things in the foreground, other things in the background. And so the question here is, when Agnon is giving us this picture of this town, what does he choose to put in the foreground? You know what the foreground is? The foreground, like in a picture, it's what's closest to you, as opposed to the background, the foreground and the background. Agnon could have chosen many different parts of reality to represent. He could have chosen to represent the lives of poor people. He could have chosen to represent the lives of the religious functionaries, the rabbis and the cantors and the functionaries in the synagogue. He could have chosen to represent political leaders, and there was actually a Jewish mayor of Buczacz for over 40 years, the one man who was elected by a coalition of Ukrainian, Polish, and Jews. So he could have chosen many things. So my question, I want to ask this question to you, what does he choose? What are the parts of this community does he choose to put this story together?
Romantic relations and
Okay.
relation between two different families.
Okay, very good. What else can we add to that?
The inner space of house.
That's very true. In other words, we're not in synagogues. We're in
Not
homes.
the club of Zionists.
Yes, we're in the Zionist club. Yes, that's a very, very good point.
Family relationships.
Family relationships. And what about the issue of class? Class, in other words, merchants, workers, nobility. What's the word in Russian for class? Class. Okay, there you go. Okay, so class is very important here. In other words, that's one of the key factors here. And okay, and what kinds of activities does he choose to put in the foreground? What people do with their lives? Occupations. What's at the center here?
Then trade, merchants, and also agriculture.
That's right. That's Gedalia, the village. That's Minna's parents are.
In addition.
Pardon?
In addition
Doctor.
Doctor.
to doctor.
But doctor
The
not
doctor.
not in Buczacz.
He's in Lemberg in
Lemberg.
Lviv. That's right. Yeah, he's a very fascinating character, and we'll get to him as well. So the selection is to examine this question of what it means to be a shopkeeper, and it's not even a merchant. A merchant, I would say, is somebody who takes goods from one place to another place and pays for them. These are people who have a store, a shop. It's a big store, and this husband and wife, Cyril and Baruch Meir, Herschel's parents, this is what they do. This is their life. And so again, these are the components, the parts that Agnon has chosen to give us this view. Now, before I go further, I just want to say something about the name of the city. What's the name of the city? Shibush. Okay. Now, Shibush is a turning around of the name of Buczacz. If you look at the Hebrew letters, you rearrange them, it forms Shibush. And Shibush in Hebrew means mistake or error.
Or even chaos.
Yes, perhaps.
Неразбериха, не раш.
So what Agnon has done is, this is clearly the town of Buczacz, but he's given it a fictional name that turns it upside down, although he doesn't make any effort to disguise the fact that this is clearly and certainly the city of the city of Buczacz. But the fact that he gives it a satirical name of Shibush alerts us to the fact that he's presenting a kind of critical, comical, ironic view of the city in which he grew up. And as I said yesterday, he wrote over the course of 55 years, he wrote about Buczacz many times. And so there are different points of view, different ways of viewing Buczacz. And here he's choosing one particular way, to view it through the lens of European realism. Agnon has many modes. Some of the modes are very Jewish modes, such as writing as in a Hasidic folktale. But here he's choosing the mode of the European novel. As I mentioned, the kind of family chronicle novel, something like Bildungroman of Thomas Mann. There are many other examples, and there's also the novel of kind of coming of age we spoke about yesterday, but here we have Herschel, older, an adult, not in bar mitzvah. So there's a connection between the literary mode of European realism. Think of it as a kind of a lens on a camera. You put the lens on and you see the reality in a certain way. So if you put the lens on of the European novel, that means you're going to be interested in romantic relationships, relationships between love and business and work, issues of class among the poor and the middle class and the wealthy, and of the question of individual freedom, because the European novel is usually about a person, sometimes a man, sometimes a woman, whose future is unclear. How is that person going to make his or her way in life? Are they going to be able to realize their desires, their destiny as a human being? Do they have individual freedom, or are their actions shaped by forces of society, a class of money? What's the relationship between eros, romance, and society? These are all of the themes of the great novels of the 19th century. And so Agnon is choosing to put on that lens, and therefore to view the object of Buczacz not as a religious community, but as a society going through changes, a society that is being changed by the forces of modernity. Politics, and as I mentioned yesterday, as part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Jews and other minorities had the mandate. They voted from 1867. There are parties, they elect mayors, they elect representatives, they enter into alliances with other groups, with Ukrainian, with Polish, for various purposes. So the lens of the novel is going to show us Buczacz as a human community rather than as a religious community. And it's interesting to note would you say that these are religious people? Let's say the Hurwitz family. There's Cyril and Baruch Meir and Herschel. Could somebody make an argument that they are religious or they're not religious?
Not so religious.
They were religious because they wanted their son to become a rabbi.
Yeah.
And they liked when he was into studying Torah.
Right, but they gave that up. In other words,
Yeah.
once he didn't show a particular enthusiasm for it, how did they feel when he entered the family business and came into the store?
They were happy with it.
Right, they weren't horribly depressed that he's not going to become a rabbi. It was in many ways more comfortable for them because he was going to be more like them. And after that time, Herschel never goes back to studying the holy books. Later in the novel, he finds, a tractate of Talmud, which is it's exactly the page where he left when he went to enter the store. And he goes back and tries to read it, and he can't make sense of it. When he was studying, it was so exciting to him, and he was deeply immersed in the world of the study of the Torah and the Talmud. But once he left to enter the world of commerce, he never looked back, and he didn't try to make it part of his life. In other words, there's a certain ideal of the merchant scholar. In other words, it's one thing if you can be a great rabbi, and a community will hire you to become a rabbi. That's very, very few people. But an even bigger ideal is to be somebody who is wealthy and doesn't depend on the community to pay you, and you're a Torah scholar. That is even a bigger deal. In fact, throughout the Middle Ages and into the modern period, and this is very relevant to our novels, how did marriages get made in Jewish society? Well, usually you had a wealthy merchant family who has a daughter, okay? What do they want who do they want that daughter to marry? Do they want the daughter to marry the son of another wealthy merchant family?
Yes.
No, that would be second best. Mm-hmm. Best is to marry the daughter to a boy who is a brilliant scholar, even if he's from a poor family. And that way, the prestige of their family is raised because they're not just merchants, they've taken into their family a religious scholar. Okay? Think about this, about what this means for how Jewish families grew. You have the energy and the practicality of being a merchant, or the quality is you have to be good to be a merchant. And if you marry that together with the intellectual qualities of scholarship, that's a pretty good mix, right? And you keep doing that generation after generation after generation, where money seeks to connect with learning. And that is something a very strong force. I just say in as a digression, the model of the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages, where you have the brightest people who are the priests who don't marry. They sometimes have children, we know this, but the brightest do not create families, but they remain celibate. And so, in a kind of way, it's the new energy has to each time come anew, rather than being propagated through the family connections. It's a very interesting, I think, difference. So, in this novel, we're at a time when that ideal is no longer working, that the ideal of having a religious scholar is no longer practical. This is a world in which a middle-class ethic of money is what is controlling things. All the people in the story continue to observe religious rituals. So the men pray every morning. They put on the tefillin on their arms and the talit, the prayer shawl. The real question is whether they do that at home or they get up and go to the synagogue. And Herschel sometimes, when he goes to the synagogue, it's to get away from Minna. So they're not very religious. They're practicing. Of course, they're eating kosher food, but it is a low level. It's a kind of a level of what all males do, but it's no longer important. For Gedalia, that's Minna's father, he is more of a pious man. He's not very learned, but it's important to him to give charity and to practice the rituals. And what's one of his motivations? What is he afraid of? This is just an aside. All the time he has a great anxiety. Do you remember what that was? What's going to happen?
He's afraid that something must be happening.
Yes, he's very successful, and he feels that his success is
something wrong.
There's something wrong with him, and it's going to be taken away. Some tragedy is going to happen all the time, and that's how he understands Herschel's madness later on. So again, I'm just establishing the fact that it may look to you that these are people that are very involved in religious life, but the fact is they're doing the minimum, or at least through the lens that Agnon is putting on, that he's chosen to focus on families who take this for granted, but it's not really what's most dynamic to them. What's most dynamic to Cyril and Baruch Meir is the shop and making money. And that's what I want to get to now. Because the great conflict in the story is between the life of the emotions, romance, sentiment, feelings on the one side, and the life of business, of what we might call a mercantile ethos, way of life, which is embodied by the store and by Cyril in particular, and by Baruch Meir. So the question is, what kind of human values are represented in someone like Cyril? She's an individual person, but she is presented here as, in a sense, the ideal or complete shop owner. She's very successful, she's very good at it. And what are the personal qualities that make her mesh with being good at business? Because this is what Agnon is looking at in the novel here, it's a set of values. It's not just an occupation. And what are the values that are important to Cyril?
Traditions, Jewish traditions.
Well, you know, if it was so important to her, then she might have been more upset that Herschel's not going to become a rabbi, but he's going to the shop. Or
she has strong will.
Strong will. Okay.
She's very
Wait, listen back, go ahead.
Sorry, she has kindness, but this is very
Oh,
special.
slowly again?
Kindness, but this is very interesting kind of kindness, because she kind in a very practical way. So she kind with her customers. She kind with her customers, just and thinking about her business, about her commerce all the time.
Okay, let's take her customers. Let's take your comment. How does she behave with her customers?
Polite,
Smiling.
Smiling. What is she good at? communication, but she's also a good reader or interpreter of human nature. In other words, when somebody comes into the shop, what does she have a talent for doing?
Giving good advices. So
Right.
a lot of people just going for this portion of her advices. So.
Okay, but that doesn't, that I guess brings people into the shop. But part of it is it's a question of giving credit,
Yes.
allowing which customers to buy on credit and which not, and what is she good at in understanding each customer. Remember, it says somebody will come in and they'll look very well tailored, make an elegant appearance, but after a few minutes of conversation, what can she tell?
She can recognize that he has debts.
He has debts, and he has no money.
And another who is not so good looking or fashionable,
Right.
but he does not has.
He may have a lot of money, and he doesn't want to spend the money.
Spend money, maybe.
So she is an excellent psychologist, right? She can read every customer, and she can also be extremely charmant, very charming. She makes everybody feel very comfortable, right? She can turn on the charm. She, as you said, she can engage all of them in conversation and make them feel at home. Because as the narrator says, what they sell in their shop is sold by a dozen other merchants. So why should some people come to their store, their shop, and not to others? Is because of Cyril's talents as a saleswoman. She is somebody who is nice to people, but that niceness is very calculated. In other words, it's a kindness. It doesn't mean that she's a mean or terrible person, but it's something that is presented for the purpose of profit. And it's naturally part of her. She's very good at this. And her husband, manages the supplies and the stock and so forth. She is the face with the customers, and she's excellent at this. So we're in a world in which all human values are measured according to their effectiveness in the matter of business. And so this is something that that in the 19th century was portrayed by Dickens and others as in Latin, homo economicus, right? The human being who is motivated by economic considerations, economic man, so forth. And again, it's not something terrible, but it's a way to understand this is, homo in Latin is man, and economicus. Okay? But what Agnon is trying to do is to try to do an analysis of a set of values. What happens in a society in which all human feelings are subordinated, made dependent upon the success of business. Okay? As it says in one passage, somebody like Cyril can understand things that can be measured, like cloth or weighed. Something you can weigh and measure has reality to her. And the world of feelings, this is not what she's good at. And she's a terrible mother also. She never showed Herschel much love. he was a late child, and he was brought up by maids of one sort or another. She was in the store, you know, a lot of the time. And there's a kind of a unity between her personality and the idea of the store as representing who she is and the family. So this is a world in which feelings and sentiments are made dependent on the life of business. And again, it's not horrible. In other words, she's not a bad person, but she is a person in this mold. The problem comes when it has to do with a key decision about whom Herschel is going to marry. Okay, this is the key plot development in the novel. There is Bluma. And it's a little complicated, what's Bluma's relationship to the family?
She's a nephew,
Neat.
and she's a daughter of her mother was in love with his father.
Right, so her mother was once the fiancée of Baruch Meir, Herschel's father, right? But he didn't continue with that because it was a poor family, and instead he was offered the daughter of his employer. He himself did not have much money. He was a good worker and worked for Cyril's father. And at some point, Cyril was older already, and she was not married. And why wasn't she married for some time?
She had a brother, which was something...
He was mad or insane and so forth. And why did that prevent her from getting married?
She was afraid that
well, I don't know if she was afraid as much as...
He was afraid. He go away.
Marriage is a market, right? And your marriageability, your attractiveness as a girl has to do with how your family is perceived. Whether you have money, whether you have learning and scholarship, and if there's something shameful...
That heritage.
Heritage, yes. Yichus, also in Yiddish. Very, very important, thank you for that. But here we have something that's like a black spot. You know, there's a brother who's mad, and people believe then, and there's some truth to insanity being biologically inheritable. In other words, it's in the family, as people believed at that time. So even though she was the daughter of a wealthy merchant, her chances, her prospects weren't so good. And so time went by, and then her father gave her to somebody who was not wealthy, Baruch Meir, because he wanted her married. And he liked Baruch Meir as well. So, and that issue of madness in the family, of course, becomes very important. So Baruch Meir threw over Bluma's mother and married Cyril. Okay? Bluma's mother died, and the father died, and then Bluma has nowhere to go. So she comes to her cousin and becomes a maidservant there. Okay? And it is a strange position, because she's not simply a poor girl who is a servant, she is a cousin as well. But Cyril treats her, you know, she's a very good worker, and they treat her with respect, but they work her very hard. So what happens between Bluma and Herschel? What are their ages?
The same age.
About the same, that's right. And if the story begins when Herschel is 16 years old, right, they in a sense grow up together. And it says that they're almost like twins. It begins with Herschel not knowing anything about girls. And why does he fall in love with Blume, even without realizing it himself? I mean, I would fall in love with Blume. She's seems to be, but and she's beautiful and so forth. But why do you think he is somebody who has no experience with women? Why does he fall in love with Blume?
Spark of eros, of emotions.
Yes, well, that's what falling in love is about. But why with her?
Maybe she's the only girl in his surrounding, in a sense.
So
A girl of flesh.
Yes.
Why not?
But
She's very classic kind of European, I don't know, a character of some novels. She is very kind and she is absolutely without she's described without any comic senses, and she's like butterfly, and she's too European, and she's
too European. It's interesting about you with
I
European.
mean, she's like Isolde, you know, and he's like Tristan in this kind of relationships.
In what way is she European?
I mean, not she, but her character is a real, you know, like example of European novels, love novels.
Interesting. That's interesting. She does read. She's a reader, which is important because not all women at that time were. And when Herschel gets books from this library of the Zionist Society, she reads. She's one of the only figures in the book who is not made fun of in some way. She's very grounded, very serious. She does her work, but she has a sense of personal freedom and of independence. And even though she is alone in life, and if you've met European, if you've read novels like Jane Eyre, or about governesses who come into households, Blume is something of that figure. She has the independence of it and the desire to preserve her dignity. And she's not interested in money per se. She works very hard. But I think it's also because as a boy, they grow up together. It's as if they're brother and sister. So he's able to feel naturally for her the way he wouldn't for a girl who would be a foreign object that he's able to know her and to connect his soul with her. And so that's very strong. But he's not allowed to by the mother. So Cyril has an intuition that this is happening, and she begins the prospect with the marriage broker, Jonah Teubel, to look for a match. And they find Minna, who's the only daughter of Gedalia and Bertha. And why, in Cyril's mind, is that a proper match for Herschel? Why, in other words, why would she not say, wonderful, Herschel, Blume, terrific? Why does she not even consider it?
Because Blume wasn't rich, he had no money.
Well, you know, it's interesting because they have enough money. You know, the Zimlachs.
But Zimmer wants that girls which must be with Herschel must have enough money for to end business, family business.
Yeah. So in other words, if they can make an alliance with Minna's family, then I'm using the word alliance, like two countries. what's the Russian word for alliance?
Alliance.
Союз.
Okay, thank you.
Союз.
So it's like a business partnership. In other words, she, according to her norms, it's not about she wants money, but the right thing to do is to increase the substance, the wealth. You don't marry and kind of give money away. Her worldview can only think of marriage as a partnership that will make things bigger and better. And that's the relationship she has with her husband, Baruch Meir, as well. Do they love each other? Yes, they love each other, but it's not a romance. And what's the scene in which they have the most partnership with each other? What time of day do Cyril and Baruch Meir enjoy being together most?
In evening. After
And what are they doing?
they close the
shop and they're counting the
Count the
money
money.
from the day. And they really enjoy each other's company. In other words, this is a kind of happy partnership. It's not a romance, but it's a happy partnership in which they are participating, joining with each other. And this is what she understands, this is what Cyril understands. And if you think about it as well, marriage in traditional society, whether it's a Jewish society or Polish, Ukrainian society, it's not until around this time, at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, that the idea that marriage should be based on love or romance. This is only in those novels by, Jane Austen and the Brontes. But marriages were arranged by families. And they were always alliances of one sort or another. And very often the bride and the groom either didn't know each other well, or certainly had not fallen in love with each other. And the love came later. It came by living the life together with those values. And the same thing today in some societies, like in India today. Marriages by, wealthy families, doctors, lawyers, and so forth, are arranged marriages. In other words, it's not two young people falling in love, because that's unstable. That does not create a society, so the argument would be. And the parents of both families know a lot more about what would make a good marriage than, two people 18 years old who are operating just over their hormones and their feelings, and they're falling in love and so forth. So we're at a point in society where things are changing, just beginning to change. And Cyril's worldview is more the norm than the idea that love should be the basis on which marriage is entered into. And so the whole idea of the novel, in European languages, it may be the same in Ukrainian and Russian. What's the word for novel? It's roman? Roman, okay. Where does that come from?
Romantic story.
Yes. So it's in the essence of the novel as a type of writing or genre that it has something to do with romance. So this is a novel in which there is a romance, but the romance is pushed to the side in the first third of the novel. Herschel does not protest. He accepts. He's pushed into it. In fact, the engagement announcement is made at this party. They don't even decide to do it. He is very passive as a hero. He's not active. He's gives into things. And he gives up Bluma. And Bluma goes away. She leaves the story, and she becomes a maid for another family in the town which lives at a distance. And in 2 days, you're going to read the story about that family, about a Kavya Mazal. So it'll come back. So she's there, but Herschel does not see her. She's out of his life, and he goes with the flow, as we say in English. He goes along. He goes with the flow, and he allows his mother and her values to predominate. And so the rest of the novel is about the consequences, the result of the suppression of that feeling. And this is what happens. We have most of the novel is about the marriage to Minna, which is terrible in many ways. And then Herschel has his breakdown, and he goes to Lemberg to be cured by Dr. Langsam. And then he returns. At the end, he somehow reintegrates into the marriage with Minna. And that's one of the things that's very unusual about this novel, because most novels would not be about making peace, reconciling yourself to not the love option, but the compromise option. In other words, most novels would be about how love triumphs and how he, let's say Herschel, breaks with his family in order to marry Bluma, and they have a lot of problems and so on and so forth. No, this is a novel in which the economic values of the society are dominant. And somehow in the end, Herschel is able to, after his breakdown, to accept that. And he finds a certain kind of limited happiness. And one of the questions we'll talk about before we end today is the ending of the novel and how you interpret that ending. Is it a happy ending or an unhappy ending? Really interesting question. Okay, so let's say something about Minna for a moment. What kind of girl is she?
Not romantic at all. But at the end of the novel, she's also changing, because maybe her attitude to her of Gilish is also changing.
Okay, before she changes, in other words, just who she is, what are her, how has she been shaped? What would you say about her as a character?
She's a new generation of social women type in this.
A new type. She's not political or social in that sense, but what about her education? This is very interesting. Most girls were not given an education at that time. They were educated at home. They were taught to read. But she was sent away to a boarding school in what was called at the time Stanislav. Now it's Franco. Right, which was a much bigger city at the time. She was at a Jewish boarding school, but which taught French, and it played the piano and needlepoint. In other words, to become a proper young lady. And do you remember what happened at that school? The headmistress married a Polish non-Jew, and the school was closed. So this is very interesting. Her father, Gedalia, is a very pious man, but they generally allowed women a more of a European education. And so she got a kind of European education, but she's not intellectual. She has no interest in books. She plays the piano very badly. She does needlepoint and sewing. And so she's been given an education being a kind of wealthy man's daughter who dresses well, and who doesn't work very hard because she has servants, and who is supposed to be part of a kind of new emerging middle class. So she's an ordinary girl, and she's, I think she loves Herschel, but Herschel cannot give her very much because he is suffering. And so the question is, why is he suffering? And you have all of the different stages in his decline and disintegration. He can't sleep. At first they have a lot of people visiting the house, and then he doesn't want to see anybody. And then he does anything to get out of the house, and he goes to the Zionist club. He has no real contact with Minna at all. He doesn't want to be at home. What's the problem here? What's wrong with this marriage?
Because of his dreams about Buna.
He's never
Connected.
never dealt with that. He is somebody who is very innocent, very unself-conscious. He accepted the removal of Bluma from his life, and he is also somebody who's not been raised with much love. Cyril is a mother who was a very castrating mother. She did not give him very much. And so he can't, it's very hard for him to love in return. And he doesn't feel that for Minna. And he doesn't share very much with her. And he's incapable of doing it. And things get worse and worse and worse until he goes crazy. He has a breakdown. And that breakdown is portrayed through the use of images about birds. And if you reread the novel, there's a lot about cocks and about doves and about birds of one sort or another. It's a whole motif in the story. And his final breakdown is when he goes into the woods and he makes sounds like a bird, and he loses his sanity. And so why would you say this happens? What is responsible for his breakdown? The suppression of the love for Bluma that was denied. It has something to do also with how he was raised by his mother. His difficulty accepting the role of being a shopkeeper. His anger at himself for being so passive. There are many focuses, and there may even be something biological in this question of genes from Cyril's uncle as well. All of these are possible. He has a breakdown, and the only thing they can do is either bring him to a Hasidic wonder-working rabbi, which they don't do. Instead, they bring him to a Dr. Langsam in Lemberg, who has a sanatorium. What does langsam mean in German?
Slow.
Slow. And that's the nature of the therapy that he has. Now, it would be very tempting to see this kind of therapy as modern psychology, as Freud. But Dr. Langsam does not talk to him about his suffering and his trauma. He doesn't talk to him about Bluma. What is the kind of treatment, the kind of sessions that Dr. Langsam offers?
He's slow describing life in a village, in a town.
Right.
And he also trying to describe people's life, ordinary life.
Yes.
Without any feelings.
Yes, go ahead.
In a very ironic way, like he's making love of all of this.
Is it very ironic? Is that what you said?
To me, yeah.
Well, he's talking about the village he grew up in
Well,
40 years ago, which he has not gone back to. He has no desire to go back to it. But he describes all of the different characters, the blind musicians, and this life of the village, and he tells tales about it endlessly to Herschel. And somehow, together with the quiet and the diet and so forth, Herschel recovers. And this is one of the questions of the novel about why does this kind of therapy succeed, and what is its purpose?
I think we have to put the question in a little bit other way. Not how or why he recovers, but if. He's socialized, yes.
He is socialized.
But is he indeed happy?
If that's your definition of success. He is functioning in the marriage.
Yes, he's functioning.
And he is happy in his work in the shop.
But
and he is being a good father, especially to the second child. Let me just say, we don't have a lot of time. That's not a little. In other words, if you would ask a psychologist, what would it mean for somebody to recover from a breakdown? They might say to be able to function in society as in your roles as a worker and as a husband, as a father. Happiness,
so
this is a bigger question.
But that's a big question of our novel. If the character if he had been happy at all.
Well, one of the questions is happiness what life is about?
Yes.
Is that the criteria? So, to get back to Dr. Langsam, what Dr. Langsam seems to do is to re-socialize Herschel. He allows him somehow to be able to readapt, to reconcile himself to the life in Shibush. He couldn't even hear the word for a long time, or think about the town. It made him crazy. But the therapy somehow allows him to re-enter and to accept his role there. And it's very, very interesting. It's a kind of storytelling therapy, a kind of narrative therapy, which has this result. So he comes back, and what kind of a person is he? He can take pleasure in his relationship with Minna. It's not a grand romance, but it is a real relationship. He can function in the shop. He finds pleasure in being a father. But he is very limited in the range of emotion that he can feel. I think this is what you were getting at. And one of the key moments at the very end of the novel is when he sees the blind beggar. I just wanted to read this apart for a second. The two of them crunched through the snow, which seemed to sing beneath their feet. Or was it really the snow that they heard? Sitting cross-legged in it and strumming as he sang was a blind musician. And though he could not have been one of Dr. Langsam's beggars, whom Herschel had always pictured squatting in the hot summer sun of the doctor's hometown, his song, that was boundlessly sad and sweet, seemed to have no beginning and no end. Yet Herschel and Minna stood perfectly still, as if waiting for him to finish. Suddenly, Herschel seized Minna's arm and said, "Let's go." Had it not sent a shiver down her spine, she might have stopped to wonder at the harshness of his voice. They had already taken several steps when Herschel turned back and tossed the musician a coin. Had not the beggar been blind, he would have been amazed by the sight of it, for it was bigger than any coin that anyone like him was ever given. So this is a very pivotal symbolic moment. What is so disturbing to Herschel? Why does he take Minna's hand and drag her away? Why can't he stand there and enjoy the music more?
Because it reminds him the process of therapy and actually reasons to be treated by Dr. Mann?
Because music is a topos of feeling and eros, and he can't let that be stirred up inside of himself. He needs to keep things very controlled. And that whole dimension of art and feeling and eros has to be kept. It's not part of him now. He has made a kind of decision or a compact to be sane, but to give that up in order to live this more bourgeois life. But what about the coin?
It was a golden coin.
Yes, this is a big...
And this blind musician never
doesn't
recognized that it was gold.
And he doesn't do it right away. He goes a few steps and then tosses the coin. What do you think the coin represents? Is it just his being charitable?
No.
Maybe it's a replace money. When the money replaced these feelings. Maybe this.
Something like that, but it's not the way in which a businessman would do it. It's a kind of acknowledgement of what he doesn't have. It's about a kind of a compensation that I cannot allow myself to be moved by art or by music or by deep feeling, but yet the coin pays something toward it, is an acknowledgement. And it's a very, I think, nice adjustment at the end about what's been achieved and what's been lost. So there's no pretense here at the end of happiness. What there is accommodation and adjustment to the world of Shibush, Buczacz, of taking responsibility for the decisions that were made by his passivity of having given up Bluma, accepting his role, and realizing that that world of happiness and feeling is something that he's never going to have, yet he wants to support it in somebody else. He doesn't negate it, but he can only do it through money, not through his own participation in
But
his
then
being.
again, we have this image of a beggar,
Yes?
which is, I guess, it's a meta-image, which is
Oh, what kind of image?
meta-image, which
That
we
image,
can meet in several novels, and maybe that's something bigger, that's something more important.
Well, if you think about the beggar is somebody who has nothing. All the beggar has is his song. And this is a blind beggar as well. And he has to depend upon the kindness of others. So this is a figure for art, which cannot support itself. The artist has to live without the comforts of family and of a basis in life, has to be supported by others. It's very risky, it's very isolated. That's not the life that Herschel can live. He can't even integrate it into his life, but he acknowledges it. So, in conclusion, we have a European novel which in some ways goes against the essential convention of the European novel, which is romance. So here the romance disappears and it becomes a novel which is a novel about reconciliation, about acceptance and reintegration, and about what has to be given up in order for that to be maintained. In many other parts of Agnon, the sacrifice of the loneliness of the artist will be at the center. But again, this is a work which is shaped by the lens of that European realism that Agnon has chosen to introduce us to this world of Buczacz at this time, which we will meet at other times as well. Any other questions about for today? Okay. Did you enjoy reading this? Like it?
Right.
Yeah. Any dissents there, or not so much, or find it easy or difficult, or?
Easy to follow.
Okay, good. Okay, thank you. We'll see you tomorrow. Okay.